Raise the flag.
Light the cauldron. We declare the game's Odyssey open.
Welcome to the Games Odyssey podcast, your home for stories of glory from the Olympics and Paralympics. I'm Jonathan Jordan.
And I'm Sarah Patton. We both love the Olympics and Paralympics, and we love history. And most of all, we love Olympic and Paralympic history, which is why we are on a journey through all of the Olympic and Paralympic games, from the ancient Olympics held at Olympia all the way to now.
Yes, and I'm always excited to talk about the games. Obviously, that's why we're here, but I'm especially excited about our topic today because the Intercalated Games of 1906 is one of those stories that's been almost forgotten by history, or hidden might actually be a better word rather than forgotten. But I think by the end of our discussion today that everyone is going to hopefully agree with me that these forgotten games practically saved the Olympic movement after the back-to-back disasters of Paris 1900 and then the debacle that was St. Louis 1904. So Sarah, I know we have talked about this briefly in the past, but I think when we first started up the podcast, you told me you had never really heard of the Intercalated Games before. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, you are remembering that correctly. I remember seeing the name, but not knowing much about it, and thought, oh, is it one of these things like the Pan Am Games or the Goodwill Games that I remember watching a long time ago? Or Commonwealth, there's all these sporting events that are more regional.
Yeah.
And I think I had seen it maybe in a book or in passing. And then as we started reading more and researching more with getting ready for the podcast and whatnot, I just remember Googling it and being so surprised at what we learned about the Intercalated Games. What about you? When did you learn about the Intercalated Games?
You know, I think I probably first learned about them about a year and a half ago. And it was really one of those topics that, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record because I've said this on the podcast before, but it's actually one of the topics that made me want to start the show because it has been kind of forgotten about. And it's just this really interesting slice of history that, like we already said, has kind of been forgotten about or hidden and tucked away. And at the same time, it holds a really special and important place in the story of the games, especially this early on in the movement. Mm-hmm. So on that note, Sarah, let's talk about a couple of highlights before we actually dig into the story of these games.
Yeah, so to start off, the 1906 games were recognized as official Olympic Games at the time that they were held, but today they are not. They were the first Olympic Games to have both a real opening and closing ceremony, which personally, we all know I'm a fan of the opening ceremonies. They were also the first games to have official national delegations with 20 national committees present with a total of 854 athletes. And the games featured 78 medal events representing 14 sports disciplines, running from April 22nd to May 2nd, so much shorter than the previous two Olympiads and shorter than the 1908 London Games, but more in line with what we're used to now.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to me, at least, that given all of those firsts that you just listed off, why is this no longer considered an official Olympic Games? And that was really one of those questions that made me dig into this topic a bit more. And yeah, it seems like it was considered official at the time, but was it? Was there conflict around that? Was there disagreement? Well, anyway, we'll dig into that. First, we'll take a little bit of a break, and then we're going to get into the real story of these games. So we'll be back in just a second. All right, so let's go back to 1896 for a minute before we get into 1906. So at the end of those inaugural Olympic Games, you might recall that good old King George of Greece was so pleased with how the Olympics had gone that he was eager to host every Olympiad there in Athens. And he wasn't the only one who was a fan of that idea. We talked about how members of the first Team USA even signed a petition saying that they would support Athens as a perpetual host and commit to traveling there again. But Baron Pierre de Coubertin, it always comes back to him and his vision for the games. He really saw the modern movement as rotating the host cities between different nations. So from his perspective, this was a no-go idea. But then we had the 1900 games in Paris that were such a disaster and so confusing that the IOC decided to reconsider King George's offer. Now, they still wanted to preserve the 4-year Olympiad because obviously that harkens back to the ancient Olympic Games and the whole purpose of an Olympiad. But they were willing to say, what if there was a half-Olympiad between the Olympic Games that's just held on a smaller scale? So these intercalated games, which intercalated is just a fancy word for in between. I have an English degree and I had to look that up. So if you didn't know what the word meant, you're in very good company here. But
like
these intercalated yes. Yeah, absolutely. Not exactly a word that you hear people using every day. but maybe we should. Maybe we should just start saying intercalated anytime we want to say in between. I don't know. That's probably going to get you kicked out of some friend circles pretty quickly if you do that. Anyway, these intercalated games that they were considering could be a bit of a compromise because on one hand, they could keep King George happy. And obviously, Greek support of the games was really, really important for the movement. And maybe these half-Olympiads could help generate interest and momentum for the full Olympiads that would happen on the regular Olympiad dates, right? So it was a little bit of a political compromise in some ways. And, you know, the Greeks had a pretty good argument. They had already proved that they could pull off a successful games with 1896. Yes, it wasn't perfect. And if you haven't listened to those episodes, go back and listen to them and you'll see what we mean. But overall, those games had been really well organized with all things considered for the time. Plus, Athens already had those venues that could be used for the most popular sports that they would focus on for the intercalated games. Plus, you had Crown Prince Constantine, who had been a huge fan of the Olympic Games. Remember, he even ran onto the track at the end of the marathon, and that whole thing happened. So, and he had been the president of the organizing committee for those original games. So the IOC endorsed the idea of him continuing in that role, and for the Greek committee to have full control of organizing the intercalated games so that they could stay focused on 1904, since those games had not happened yet. Of course, we know how that turned out, but, you know, hindsight is 2020. So, yeah, the intercalated games simply was there to be a compromise, have an intermediate games, keep support going, etc., etc. Now, the total number of events for those games would be scaled down from what had happened at 1900 and what was planned for 1904. So just like in 1896, the games wouldn't be planned to run as long either, as you just mentioned. So in 1901, the IOC officially endorsed the Greek Olympic Committee to be in charge of organizing the 1906 games. Now, why 1906? Because obviously 1896, this is 10 years later, so why the gap? Well, 1902 would have been a little bit too short notice for them to actually be able to plan things out and get the word out effectively. And the idea was for these half-Olympiads or intermediate Olympiads, whatever you want to call them. The idea was for them to run every 4 years as well. So you would have games in 1906, then 1910, 1914, and so on and so on. So yeah, official full Olympiad in rotating host cities, and then the Intercalated Games happening perpetually in Athens as the host. So yeah, it sounds a little bit confusing, but at the same time, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, it's really not so different than what we do with alternating the summer and winter games now.
No, I agree. Because as we're talking about this, I was thinking about the Winter Olympics that we get those 2 years after the Summer Olympics. And so it's interesting how those are also in 2-year increments, which for us Olympic and Paralympic fans, that's great news because we only have to wait 2 years for an Olympic and Paralympic game cycle to come in. So yeah, it's really interesting. And hearing about the origin of the Intercalated Games, I mean, it kind of makes sense. Like I see what they were going for. And, you know, we have the luxury of hindsight where we're like, oh, why don't y'all just do summer and winter games, you know? But I see where they were coming from, and I'm really fascinated by all of this and the history of it.
Well, and you have to remember that because this was so early on in the movement, we didn't have a lot of those things you mentioned before, like the Commonwealth Games and the Pan Am Games and the World Championships. Like those tournaments didn't exist yet. So I think there was a good argument that, hey, we could generate interest in sports over the long term by just having another event, but we'll just have it in Athens all of the time. And this idea hasn't completely gone away. I still see people suggesting the idea of a perpetual host site, and Athens gets brought up all the time simply because of the historical significance of Greece with the Olympic Games. So yeah, these ideas haven't really gone away 100+ years later. So right now, yeah, I'm on board. This totally makes sense for the movement at this time. But yeah, so let's continue talking about some of the things about these games that were kind of unique and set them apart from 1900 and from 1904 specifically. So what were some of those first?
Yeah, some of the first for the games. These were the first games where all of the athletes had to register through their National Olympic Committee instead of just showing up like they did in years past, which again, this is one of those things that makes sense. And again, like I know we're going to keep talking about this, but for being the forgotten games, something that we still see today. Yeah, such a legacy, but I know we'll get more into that.
Yeah, well, and you know, there's a part of that I agree with you. It's like, yes, this makes sense that we do things this way because it is more organized. But then it also means we lose the opportunity to have people like Felix Carvajal just showing up.
That is true. If you listen to our episode on St. Louis, you know that we love Felix. We've talked about him on social media. We'll probably talk about him again because there's just a lot about him. Anyway, so yes, it is a shame that we don't get that experience as much, but the National Olympic Committees, in a lot of ways, they make sense. Now, eventually there's going to be a lot of corruption that sneaks in, but as we already know, that's par for the course with the Olympics, unfortunately.
Right.
So back to the first that we saw at the Intercalated Games. Here we saw the first Olympic village for the athletes, which was located at the Zipkion, the facility that was built for the cycling events at the 1896 Games and named in honor of Evangelos Zappis.
Evangelos.
I know. I knew as soon as I said it. I was like, okay, let me say it again. Why can I never say Greek names?
Evangelos.
Even though I practiced this. This one I did practice earlier because we've talked about him before.
Yeah.
Evangelos.
Evangelos.
Yeah.
Evangelos.
Okay.
I'm just gonna leave all of this in, just so that people understand, like, we try our best, you know.
Y'all, we love other cultures. I promise you that Jonathan and I both love other cultures.
I do
so
great with
much.
Yeah, I'm excited for when we have more Spanish names, because I can knock Spanish names out of the park. I'm great with pronouncing those.
I can do Japanese.
I do pretty decently with Japanese names too. So it's like, if it's Spanish, Japanese names, I can handle those pretty well. But even English names, I struggle with. So
yes,
so yeah,
same.
It's on the table.
We're so sorry.
Anyway.
We're trying our best. It's not because we don't care.
Yeah.
Anyway. The Intercalated Games were the first games to have medal ceremonies where the flag was also raised up in honor of the medalist. It's pretty cool.
That's fun. Yeah.
We saw the first true opening ceremony, as we would think of it, a separate event where the athletes actually entered the stadium in a parade of nations marching behind their national flag carried by a flag bearer. Also really important. And then these were also the first games to have a formal closing ceremony. Though there's a bit of debate on that, since there was a kind of closing ceremony for the 1896 games. It was apparently attended by 6,000 school-aged children. We're not sure where their parents were, but there you go. Maybe they just had like the most epic field trip day of all time.
Yeah, it seemed like an important fact that someone pointed out that there were 6,000 children there. But yeah, a note about the opening and closing ceremony, I think, because this was something that caught me a little off guard, is I thought we talked about an opening ceremony and closing ceremony for the 1896 games. But I think the difference is that with the opening of the 1896 games, it wasn't a separate event. They opened the games, but there wasn't a real parade of nations, and then they literally started competing right away after the games were open. And then same thing with the closing ceremony, they gave out all of the awards and then they gave a send-off, but it wasn't really a separate event. So I think that's where the distinction is made, is that it was specifically set aside to be an official opening and a official closing. At least that's what makes sense to me. I don't know.
No, yeah, definitely. Because I feel like we did talk about it when we talked about the opening ceremony before. It really was like, all right, you walked in, now bam, go get on the track.
Right.
Pretty much. That's how I envision it.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's, and every source seemed to say the same thing, that yes, they, King George did his opening speech, but they literally jumped in, because we talked about Team USA, how they showed up literally just a couple hours before the ceremony started. So there was no preparation time. They just had to jump on the track and do their thing right away. But anyway, it's fascinating that all of those things happened first here at the Intercalated Games, and yet again, they've been forgotten about. The Olympic Village, the opening ceremony, closing ceremony, the flags being raised. I mean, these are all staples now of the Olympic and Paralympic experience as we think about it. So I thought it was really cool that it all came from 1906, and that the Greeks really get to take credit for coming up with these ideas. So I think that's important to point out as well, that it was the Greek Olympic Committee who really said, let's do these things and see how it goes. But yeah, anyway, let's talk a little bit about who showed up for the Intercalated Games.
Well, there were 20 nations that competed, with Finland making its debut. And not just making their debut, but they also won their first gold when Werner Järvinen, he won Greek discus. Poor Greece. He'd also go on to win bronze in Greek discus in 1908.
I forgot to put this in the notes, but apparently at this games, they decided to start splitting the discus event, because I don't know that I found evidence of this at previous Olympiads, but they had, just discus kind of Robert Garrett style, where it was freestyle discus, throw it however you want to, right? But then they decided, okay, let's have a separate Greek discus event. So you have to do it with the Greek style. And yet the poor Greeks, they just still, you got a Finnish guy coming in here and, and winning at their own style of discus. Anyway, I don't know. I feel bad for them, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's nice. It's kind to feel sorry for them. This was the first time the United States actually selected their team. So I guess sort of an Olympic trials process.
Mm-hmm.
In total, there were 854 athletes. Of those athletes, only 6 were women. Happy that we had some females, but still working on getting more women in there.
Right.
The largest delegation, probably not a surprise that it was Greece with 321 athletes. Italy had the second largest delegation with 76, and France had the third largest with 56 athletes. Now, moving on to the events, there were 78 events in 12 sports and 14 disciplines. So breaking it down, with aquatics, we had swimming and diving. Mm-hmm. Athletics added a pentathlon, which consisted of the standing long jump, the ancient style discus throw, the javelin throw, the 192-meter run, and a Greco-Roman wrestling match. It also added javelin as its own event, which that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And actually, let's kind of pause for a second, because I didn't think about this when we were putting this all together. But obviously, there's a lot happening in the pentathlon at the time that we're recording this. We're not going to get into all that drama, but I thought this was really interesting that the Greeks, these were the events that they picked for the pentathlon: the standing long jump, the ancient style discus throw, javelin, and if the 192-meter run sounds weird to any of our listeners, go back to our episodes on the OG Olympic Games, because we talked about the Stadion race, the original Olympic event from the ancient games, being 192 meters long. So it seems like they were literally trying to emulate the most popular events, or a lot of the most popular events from the ancient games, with this pentathlon. So anyway, I don't know. I think that's an interesting concept compared to, let's pick 5 events that represent what it means to be a soldier. I don't know. Just throwing it out there. Interesting idea.
Yeah. Thank you for that, because I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
Especially the Greco-Roman wrestling match. I think that's the one that surprised me the most in this little list.
Yeah. But again, not to get into all the drama of what's happening with the pentathlon right now, but there's a part of me that says, I don't know, this feels a little bit more accessible than some of the ideas that have been thrown around recently. But anyway, that's all I'm going to say about it for now.
Yes. We'll get there eventually.
Yeah.
So back to the events. We had cycling with road and track cycling. There was fencing, football, which, friendly reminder to the Americans listening, we're talking about not American football. We're talking about what we call soccer. So football, gymnastics, rowing, shooting, tennis, tug of war. There it is again.
Yep.
Weightlifting and wrestling.
Yeah. So for the most part, this is pretty close to the same events that were hosted in 1896, with the exception of adding in football, adding in diving, the creation of pentathlon that we just talked about, but a lot of similarities to what was featured in those 1896 games, since they already had those venues available. Now, Sarah, is there anything on this list that shocks you that wasn't included from maybe 1900 or 1904?
Well, this is a bit of a sarcastic answer. Plunge for distance.
Oh, gosh.
I'll never be over plunge for distance.
Yeah. The Greeks were not about that nonsense.
Yeah. Archery.
I'm surprised by that one being excluded as well. That was the first one I thought of.
Yep. Gosh, what else? What else had we not, or what else did we see?
Well, there's no sailing on here. Rowing is on here, but there's no sailing on here, which
you're right. That misses my girl. Elena.
Yeah, exactly. Which we talked about this with the 1896 games. They had planned on sailing, and then they ended up canceling it when they actually were supposed to have the event because no one supplied boats and no one supplied athletes, right? So maybe that's why they left it off. But a part of me says, why didn't they try again, knowing that people might actually be interested in it if they just, gave advance notice? But yeah, those are two of the ones that came to mind for me that I felt like could have been here for the intercalated games, but got left off. But yeah, I was just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, my first thought was archery because it's fresh on my mind from talking about St. Louis.
Well, and that was the only event in 1904 that women were able to participate in, and suddenly it's not here anymore. So, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, otherwise, I think the events make sense for, again, wanting to do a scaled back version of the games specifically as an intermediate event. And while we're on the topic of women competing, we'll just go ahead and jump right into that. So, Sarah, tell me, what were women allowed to do at these games?
Well, women, they got to participate in one sport. So we'll talk about that. There were only 6 female athletes at the 1906 games, all competing in tennis. There were 2 events they could compete in: the women's singles tournament and the mixed doubles tournament. The singles tournament was a sweep for Greece, with Esme Simuriati winning gold. In the mixed doubles tournament, gold was won by the French pair, Marie and Max Decougy, a married couple. Did I get it?
You got it.
See, it was in my head.
Now, to be completely forthright with our listeners, we only got that because we literally looked up the pronunciation before recording. But yeah, you got it. So yeah, speaking of Max real quick, even though we're talking about the women and now suddenly we're going to talk about a dude. So
typical.
Right, yeah, but we do need to kind of throw this in about him real quick because it does relate to why he was there at the 1906 games. So he had actually won silver in the doubles event in 1900 Paris, and then he would go on to win gold and bronze at Antwerp 1920. So he had a long tennis career, and at the 1906 games he actually won 3 golds, including this one that he won with his wifey. So here's kind of what I wanted to think about a little bit. We're both married, and so you have family hobbies essentially, and for us that's game night. We like playing games and doing that together as a family. And I just can't help but think about Marie and Max here sitting down at dinner with friends and talking about, well, what do you guys like to do together? And then being like, we like to go to the Olympics and win a gold medal together. That's one of our married hobbies that we enjoy. I mean,
totally casual.
Yeah. How many people can say that that's one of their hobbies?
I mean, Elena Portales, but
that's true. Yeah. She won gold with her husband. That's a fair point.
That was 6 years ago at this point in time. But yeah, I know of married couples that have gone to the Olympics now in like modern times that have been competing either in the same sport or, maybe different disciplines or whatever. But like, I don't recall in recent memory, it like thinking about the most recent Olympics and Paralympics, I don't recall like there actually being a partnership where they won the gold together or competed together, what about curling?
The pairs figure skating Japan team. Well, I'm blanking on them. The guy's an American. She's Japanese, and I apologize, listeners. We did not look up their names beforehand. But they're married and they compete. I can't remember if they medaled, though. I feel ashamed of myself for not remembering their names.
No, but that's also the point. And even if And even if they're not married, there's a lot of couples and ice dancing, pairs, figure skating. That's a really good point. So sorry, I wasn't trying to forget figure skaters.
Yeah.
I know that there are a couple of listeners in particular who are probably going to come at me. Go ahead. I'm ready for it. So yeah, I wasn't trying to neglect them, but I just don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah. Maybe we'll do an episode about that sometime. Maybe we'll do a wild card episode where we just talk about couples who have competed together, or maybe one of them was the coach, something along those lines. Because I know there's a ton of examples out there. We just need to go do the research for it. So here's us admitting that we don't. We've said it before, we're not experts. Part of the fun of the podcast is figuring these things out. But yeah, so, we'll have to do some digging on that. But anyway, I think Marie and Max, they have this interesting thing happening where they show up at the Olympics together as a married couple. They win gold like the De Portaleses did. And that's just kind of fun for them. So, yeah. That I guess that's what makes a marriage successful, is winning a gold medal together. Anyway.
Well, if plunge for distance comes back and it can be a co-ed event, like, we got a chance.
I do not have a chance. I'm an awful swimmer. Even plunge for I would sink. I don't float in the water. I sink like the Titanic. I just go straight down. So anyway, let's talk about some other athletes though who are notable for these games. We'll get back on topic. So one guy that stood out to me when I was doing the research here was Peter O'Connor. We love a good Irish athlete here, and Peter O'Connor is no exception to that. So he was an Irish athlete who, like we've talked about before, he wasn't real crazy about having to be included with the British delegation, since at the time all Irish athletes had to compete for the UK. I think we talked about this in 1904, that there were even some Irish athletes who showed up in St. Louis. And since Britain didn't officially send a delegation to those games, they were like, hey, can we just compete? And if that means we have to count for America, that's fine. So this is kind of continuing that tradition with Irish athletes. So he ended up winning gold in the triple jump. And since this was the first games where they actually raised the flag up for the medal ceremony, when the Union Jack flag was raised, our boy Peter climbed up the pole, hoisting in his hand the Irish flag with him, while a group of American and Irish athletes guarded the pole down below so that no one would stop him and say, hey, you have to get down from there. So, I mean, what a guy. He's like, nope, I'm not going to stand on the podium with the British flag waving over me. I'm going to climb up there with the flag in my hand, raising it high as I can. I don't know. He's a special guy.
Yeah, I mean, the guy's got guts, and I feel like at some point, and again, this is me, I don't know, we haven't talked about this, I don't think, but maybe it'd be interesting one day to do a deep dive wildcard episode on like protest at the Olympic Games. But is he the reason that podium protests became against the
yeah, well, you have to think he plays a role in that here. I mean, this really may be the first example we've run across of an actual podium protest, right? At least it's the first one we've talked about. I think it's the first one that I've researched.
I guess like first real chance with like the official medal ceremonies.
That's true. Yeah.
Wow. So yeah, people were just going to protest right from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. And not to get too far ahead of things, but when we get to 1908, we're going to talk about a couple protests that happened there that's starting to become a thing with the Olympic Games. So yeah, we're going to start seeing the IOC say, okay, we need to come up with some rules with what's allowed and what's not allowed eventually. But anyway, moving on, we're going to also talk a little bit about this guy named Billy Shering. So William Billy Shering He was a Canadian athlete of English and Irish descent. And this guy was obviously a type A planner because, get this, he wanted to run in the marathon. So what did he do? He moved to Greece 2 months before the games so that he could acclimate to the environment and get used to things. And it obviously seemed to have paid off because he ended up being a surprise winner of the marathon. And once again, Prince George here, these Greek princes, they just love jumping onto the track. So Prince George this time jumped onto the track to accompany Billy Sherring as he came into the to the Panathenaic Stadium for his little victory lap there at the end of the marathon. But this is really interesting because we haven't seen someone yet with this kind of level of dedication to say, I'm going to show up in the host city beforehand and get used to things. We see that a little bit more now with teams going over ahead of time. We see, testing of the venues and things like that happen even a year, even 2 years out before the games. But this is really kind of a first for someone actually doing that as part of their personal preparation for the games. And I don't know, I felt like that was noteworthy to bring up here. So
yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And then kind of the last really notable athlete I want to talk about, just, we've alluded to some other athletes who were there at the Intercalated Games. Obviously, this episode would be 5 hours long if we talked about everyone. But the last person I want to talk about here is Louis Richardet, who was a Swiss shooter. And the reason he's notable is because he won 2 golds at 1900 Paris. And then he won 2 golds and 1 silver here in shooting for the 1906 games. So, shooting doesn't always get a lot of publicity. We've talked about that before. It doesn't necessarily get a lot of airtime. You kind of have to go out of your way. So, recognizing that that sport doesn't always get a lot of attention, I felt like it was good to mention him because he was very successful at these games, winning 3 medals in 1906 on top of the 2 that he had won in 1900 Paris. So this is our chance to say that, shooting as a sport, we want to make sure it gets its own moment here. But yeah, that's really kind of who I wanted to, talk about here. Obviously, there were other athletes, and we've talked about a few other people being here at the Intercalated Games in past episodes. But yeah, I guess what's your take, Sarah, in terms of, who was there? Anything you want to add to that?
Well, I would like to talk more about the women, but there's not really other women to talk about.
I know.
So we can talk about who was not there, but I mean, backtracking a little bit.
Yeah.
Prince George jumping onto the track to run with Billy Sherring. I mean, I'm just saying, if I'm ever a royal and I'm present at the Olympic Games, I want to finish a race with an athlete. I would probably not be allowed to, and I could probably not keep up, but a girl can dream.
Well, yeah, I was about to say, well, it is the end of the marathon, but at the same time, with today's pace with the marathon, yeah, you still can't keep up with them at the very
Absolutely
end.
not. So. I call it jogging. I can jog a few miles nonstop. I think I'm in, not the worst shape when it comes to running. At the same time, I don't sprint very well, but like what my pace is for like 200 meters around the track could probably still not keep up with the marathoners for like their pace the entire marathon. So anyway, yeah. And also I'm talking about how I couldn't keep up with them, but I'm not even mentioning the fact that like it's unrealistic for me to become a royal suddenly. So
I mean, keep dreaming, dream big. Yeah. You're going to need to have a conversation with Nick about that, obviously.
I know. I'm just waiting for him to tell me that he's a royal.
Yeah. I mean, maybe some sort of, Princess Diaries, thing will happen and he finds out that he's actually, you know, a royal. So, like I said, we can keep dreaming, but
but anyway.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's kind of wrap up here and talk a little bit about the legacy of these games. Yeah. What else can we say about them in terms of the lasting legacy?
Well, let's start with the medal count.
Okay.
For the medal count, we had France on top of the medal table. So France, I mean,
even though they weren't the biggest delegation. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I was surprised by that a little bit. So France had 40 total medals. 15 of those were gold. Then second, we had the United States with, so yeah, we're going in order of most golds, which, right? Or like, did you put these in order by most golds? Yes.
This was the order from whatever source that I took it from. And it looks like they did it by gold first, and then total if there was a tie in gold. So yeah.
Okay. That's always up for debate, but since I was saying that United States. Yeah. Okay. So after France, you have United States with 24 total medals, 12 of which were gold. Then you had Greece with 34 total medals, 8 were gold. And then Great Britain had 24 medals, 8 of which were gold. So Great Britain and Greece, same amount of gold medals.
Yeah.
The Intercalated Games had wide international participation and wide media coverage, which helped redeem the reputation of the games after the double disasters of 1900 and 1904, and it helped build excitement for 1908. So, I mean, that's pretty cool that it kind of got a breath, it got fresh life breathed into the movement, which we've already talked about a little bit. But rejuvenated, that's a good word. This has been a very silly episode. One of the greatest impacts of the so-called forgotten games is that it introduced many of the Olympic traditions we now expect and love, like the separate opening and closing ceremonies and the flag raising for the medal ceremonies. Even if a flag may have gotten taken down. But things that we just associate automatically with the Olympics. I mean, I feel like I would freak out a little bit if we didn't have medal ceremonies and opening and closing ceremonies.
Yeah, again, not to get too far down the rabbit trail, but literally today or maybe it was last night, it's been kind of a blur this week, but I was telling my wife how excited I am about what the opening ceremony is going to look like for Paris 2024.
I'm so excited.
And that they're trying some new things. And so I was telling her, I was like, they're going to have boats for each of the delegations. And she really didn't care. She was like, okay, cool. They're going to have a boat, like whatever. And I was like, I need someone to share this excitement with. So,
if you're listening to this.
Yeah, she'll be more excited when she actually watches it. She just didn't care last night. That's it, you know. So.
Yeah, if you are listening to this and you have not looked up what opening ceremonies will look like in Paris in 2024, that is your homework right now. Like now, go do it. It's so good.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really cool. But anyway, we'll get back on track. Instead of talking about 2024. So let's get to with the legacy of these games, since they were so successful, since they were really well run, since they had all these incredible firsts, why were there no 1910 intercalated games? After all, that had kind of been the plan, was 1906, 1910, 1914, but these were the only intercalated games. So for starters, there just ended up not being enough time between 1908 and 1910 for adequate planning. But a bigger issue was that there was some political unrest happening in both Greece and really the whole Balkan region after the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, which we're not going to get into all that, but it's really messy. And it would eventually all lead up to the Balkan Wars. So everything was kind of leading up to that. And people were really more focused on political and military issues instead of focusing on organizing the next Intercalated Games. So just another one of those times where world events kind of stepped in and prevented things from happening, kind of like we saw with 1904, how world events really kept international athletes away from St. Louis. So the idea of having an intermediate games, it would be kind of resurrected, as we have already alluded to, in 1986, when the IOC would revise the Olympic Charter so that summer and winter games would be held alternately every 2 years instead of both being held in the same year. So again, the idea didn't completely go away. It was just more of a logistical thing where they weren't necessary until they realized, man, maybe we should kind of bring back this concept so that we have more time to really focus on winter games and summer games and not try to do two things at once. Now, obviously, this has led to a lot of confusion about the status of the 1906 games. So in 1949, the issue was raised about whether the Intercalated Games should be recognized as an official Olympiad. So part of the confusion on whether they were regarded as official or not at this time when this was being considered was because, first, the IOC had not been involved in the planning of the Intercalated Games, and Coubertin had not attended the Intercalated Games. But you could say that same thing about the 1904 games. Coubertin didn't attend those, nor had the IOC planned those. So, that's not the nail in the coffin in terms of their status. But a major difference is that Coubertin himself apparently didn't really want them acknowledged as a real Olympiad. And there was probably a little bit of his ego involved in that, but that's just my two.
Not him.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, not Baron Pierre de Coubertin.
Come on, guy. We only had 6 women. Shouldn't that make you happy?
Only 6 women. Yeah. His goal was 0. But we're not going to go down that topic again. You can go listen to that episode. But yeah, so yeah, Coubertin, obviously, he wasn't the only deciding voice, but he'd had a lot of influence, and he didn't really want them recognized as a real Olympiad. However, there were advocates for recognizing the 1906 games as official, and those people like to point to the fact that, hey, it was sanctioned by the IOC, whether or not Coubertin himself was a fan of the idea. They did vote and approve that it could happen. They gave permission to the Greek Olympic Committee to organize it the same way that they gave control of the 1900 games to the World's Fair Committee, the same way they gave control of the 1904 games to the AAU. Like, this was not a new thing for them to decide to give control to other people. So its advocates say, hey, that shouldn't discount it. And also, it helped save the Olympic movement. And it was the best held games at that time. So the fans of the Intercalated Games, that was their argument in 1949 for why it should be considered an official Olympiad and added into the official roster of Olympiads. But ultimately, its status had to be decided by a group known as, this is going to be a real familiar name for fans of the Olympics and Paralympics, the Brundage Commission, headed by none other than future IOC president Avery Brundage, who, he's going to be a whole topic later on. We will get to him.
Remember his name.
Yeah, so you can just consider this a teaser for when we talk about him later on. But the issue was ultimately decided as rejected. So, in other words, they said, no, the 1906 Intercalated Games were not an official Olympiad. So that's why I like to say that maybe they're not so much forgotten as much as they've been hidden away. So yeah, the Intercalated Games, they've kind of status-wise fallen more into this legend category rather than being remembered for the success that they actually were. And, Sarah, I want to get your thoughts on this, but that's part of why I wanted to have an episode dedicated to the games, even though they're not an official Olympiad because, my 2 cents, but who cares what Avery Brundage thinks. But yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts? Official, unofficial, like what should their status be from a fan's perspective?
Oh gosh. I mean, I like you calling them the hidden games.
Mm-hmm.
The part of me that is feelings based and wants everybody happy and to have an Olympic experience says, let's recognize them as official, but Sarah will never be an IOC president. I will never have a commission named after me.
Hey, dream big. Dream big. You will be a royal and you will be president of the IOC. Okay? Dream big.
Watch out, world.
Make that vision. Get your vision board right now and get it on there.
Okay. All right. You heard it here first. Although, to be fair, I kind of am royal because Sarah means princess. So there's your trivia for the day.
True.
But yeah, I mean, I would like to recognize them, but the part of me that's also such like a rule follower is also like, well, if the IOC rejected it, then it doesn't really count, which is unfortunate, but yeah. So I'm very torn. If that's not completely obvious.
Yeah.
I will also say I looked up the medals and the medals from these games looked really cool.
I actually have not seen the medals for these games.
At least
I think
so. Let me make sure that what came up on Google was actually the medal and that, let me just make sure I did my right research.
Yeah, I don't know that I've seen the medals for these games because, again, they're not going to be included in the museum because they're not official games. And I think I even found that in the research. That's one of the sources actually said something to the effect of the medals are not featured in the museum in Lausanne, Switzerland for that reason.
Correct. Okay. So yeah, it looks like what I've Googled, and I'll make sure that we get this up whenever this episode releases. But yeah, so actually this is a whole sidebar thing, but there is a Canadian who has a rare medal from the Intercalated Games. And
that's cool.
Allegedly from this article, and again, this is just a quick skim, please don't hold it against me if facts are wrong, but the American Olympic Committee, which verified the medal's identity, asked if she would donate it to the committee's collection. So that's interesting. Now, this is from something called GreekReporter.com. We'll find the link, verify it, and all that stuff. But I think that's
what
really
if it was Billy Shearing's medal? He was Canadian.
Oh my goodness. That'd be pretty cool. Anyway, yes, there are some really cool looking medals. No surprise, lots of Greek writing on it. But yeah, I mean, they look like normal Olympic medals in a lot of ways. So yeah, we'll get some information about that posted.
Yeah, and to kind of get back to what you were saying about being a rule follower, even though my heart wants to accept the 1906 Intercalated Games as an Olympiad, there is the rule follower side of me that says, yeah, but Olympiad literally means 4 years, and 1906 was not 4 years. Right. And since there was no 19 game, it would have been different if there had been a 1910 games. If there had been a 1910, 1914, if it had continued, then I'd say, yeah, they should be counted as official, just different type of Olympiad. But nonetheless, they still hold a really, really important part in the history. And again, of making sure that the movement would continue, because just as a little teaser for our next episode, which will be on the 1908 Olympic Games, the 1908 Games are going to run into a crisis. And they are going to need to be saved and rescued. And, I know it probably feels like we've dumped on the British a lot with all of our conversations about Irish athletes, but the Brits are going to come to the rescue with the 1908 Games. So, that's going to be a little bit of a teaser for what we're going to talk about with the 1908 London Games. But yeah, 1906, I think, was really essential for making sure there was momentum, making sure that there was still love for the games, even though 1900 and 1904 had not turned out so well. But yeah, we will get to 1908 and how it really did kind of leapfrog off of 1906 and save the movement. But again, we'll get into that in the next episode. But if you enjoyed this episode,
and we really hope you did,
then as I just said, we hope that you will come back next time when we revisit the 1908 Olympic Games, which were the first games to be hosted in London. And until then, Odyssey you later. The Games Odyssey podcast is a production of Wardrobe Media, LLC. This episode was written, hosted, produced, and edited by Jonathan Jordan and co-hosted by Sarah Patton. Show notes, including research sources and transcripts, can be found on our website, gamesodyssey.com. Olympic is a trademark of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, USOPC. Any use of Olympic in the Games Odyssey podcast is strictly for informational, commentary, and educational purposes. The Games Odyssey podcast is not an official podcast of the USOPC and is not sponsored, endorsed, or officially affiliated with the USOPC or the International Olympic Committee or International Paralympic Committee. The content of Games Odyssey podcast does not reflect the opinions, standards, views, or policies of the USOPC, and the USOPC in no way warrants that content featured in the Games Odyssey podcast is accurate.